Masechet Eruvin, Daf Kof Gimel. We are really nearing the end here. So we have a few Mishnayot that are going to continue the theme of differences between the Bet HaMikdash and everywhere else. So again, in the Bet HaMikdash, there are certain leniencies. Anything that is asumid rabbanan, but is required for the Bet HaMikdash service, is permitted because you're in the Bet HaMikdash, the konim around, they're going to be careful. They're not going to come to violate any d'oraita, and so therefore they can relax anything that is a gezerah. So we'll see a number of applications of this in the Mishnah and their discussion. Okay, so we start with we're going to be talking about cutting open warts and dry warts and moist warts. I hope you're not eating dinner, okay. So it can get a little unseemly. Okay. Chotchin yabelet b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So and this is talking about an animal wart. If an animal has a blemish, it's not good. It's not good. It can't be sacrificed, including if it has a wart. But if you cut it off, then it's fine. Then it's fit to be a sacrifice once again. So if this happens to fall out on Shabbat or Yom Tov, so it says you are allowed to cut it in the Bet HaMikdash, but if you have an animal at home and it has a wart, you are not allowed to cut it off. Okay, good. Ve'im bekli kan vekan asur. And if you're using a knife, then you can't do it in any place. So even in the Bet HaMikdash, if you're cutting it off with a knife, that's going to be a deoraita. You have to do it with a shinui, kilachad, a different way than usual. And so if you just pick it off with your hands, then that is permitted in the Bet HaMikdash. Okay, good. So that is the Mishnah. I have an outline, so let's look at the outline. So we have these are Shabbat leniencies in the temple. So far Mishnah in Eruvin says you are allowed to cut off a wart by hand, but not with a knife. What we're about to see is a Mishnah in Pesachim, which is appropriate because we're going to jump soon into Masechet Pesachim, so we get a little preview, and says that the Mishnah there says one may not cut off a wart. It sounds like not at all, not in any case. So we have a contradiction between these two Mishnayot, and we're going to offer 4 responses. One is that our Mishnah is talking about by hand, Pesachim is talking about when it's with a knife, that's why it's a problem. This makes a lot of sense because our Mishnah in Eruvin actually says, but not with a knife. Second answer is that Mishnah in Eruvin is talking about a dry, one that's all dried out, and so you're not really cutting it off, it just falls off, it's already not connected, barely connected. And Pesachim is talking about a fresh, moist wart, and so that's why it's a problem. But it's also by hand, still a problem. By hand, in other words, still the Rabbanan. Then Rav Yosef is going to have another answer that Mishnah Eruvin is talking about. It's in the temple, as we just read. Pesachim is actually at home, even though it's talking about Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach, you had to do a lot of the preparation before you came, because it was so busy. Then they wouldn't have time to do it all. And so if it happened to fall out on Shabbat that you have to bring it, then that would be at home. Even though it's a sacrifice for the temple, still done at home, and therefore you cannot violate that Rabbanan. And the last answer is Rava, which is Mishnah, it's Machloket. Mishnah Eruvin is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said you're allowed to do preparations, like bring the knife for a Brit Milah, and so therefore that's permitted. He's the author of the Mishnah, and Mishnah Pesachim is Rabbanan, who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, that's in quick the 4 answers that we're about to see, but it's good to have an overview because we're going to get into a lot of back and forth, like why does A disagree with B and B disagree with A, and so we're going to, we can get lost in the details, so make sure to have this, the outline in mind. All right, so the Gemara says, Urminhu, we raise up a contradiction of 2 equally authoritative sources, another Mishnah that says, Herkevo, va'avato michutz latchum, va'chatichat yabarto, en dochin. Rabbi Eliezer omer, dochin. So if you have a Korban Pesach and it's outside, you have to bring it in. If you're going to carry it, carrying is not allowed, or bringing it from Techum, outside Techum Shabbat, into Techum Shabbat, carrying your Korban Pesach, and cutting off a wart on the animal, and dochin. You cannot do those on Shabbat, right? These are these are things that you could have done before, and therefore cannot do on Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer, however, says they are doches Shabbat. You can do them, even if you could have brought it from before, from outside the Tchum, doesn't matter. You're still allowed to bring it. You're still allowed to do all these things on Shabbat because Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that, for example, you can make a fire in order to sharpen a knife, to create a knife, so that you could do Brit Milah, and you can do that on purpose. Whereas everybody agrees, obviously, that the Brit Milah itself you can do, but even the preparations for Brit Milah, and similarly here, everybody agrees that you can do it, make a korban on Shabbat or Yom Tov, but Rabbi says even the preparations for it can be done. So now we have a contradiction. Mishnah says one is permitted to cut the wart, and this Mishnah, Pesachim, says you are not allowed to cut the wart of the animal. So how are we going to resolve this? Two answers in one here. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina. We don't know who said which. We just know that these two Amoraim gave answers. Chad Amar, ha veha belacha, belakashia, kan beyad, vekan bakli. He says they're both talking about regular moist warts, but there's a difference that one is talking about doing it by hand. That's the Mishnah. By hand is always better because it's not the usual way to do it. That's permitted. Whereas the Mishnah in Pesachim, which says it's not allowed, is talking about if using a knife. That's the regular way to do it, and that would be asur. Okay, good. So that makes sense. Further, chayav, that would be probably midoraita. Okay, Chadamar, answer number two, however, is ha veha beyad. No, they're both talking about cutting it off, but with your hand in an indirect way. So in other words, it would be maximum midrabanan. Velakashia ha belacha ha be besha. The Mishnah Pesachim, which says it's not allowed, that's talking about a moist wart. So they can't, that's a problem, more problematic. And our Mishnah in Eruvin is talking about one that's dry. So it's not really even taking it off. It just kind of crackles when you scrape it off, and so that's why it's permitted. Okay, so those are the two opinions. Now let's ask about each one. The first answer, why doesn't he say the second answer? What's wrong with that one? Because he would say, if it's dried out, then you can even use a knife because it's all dried out and it just crumbles on its own. So therefore, something dried out would for sure be permitted even with a knife. And so therefore, there would be no problem at all with it. So we can't be talking about that case. Right, so yeah. So therefore, the Mishnah, because the Mishnah here says, and if it's with a knife, it's not allowed. So if it's talking about something dry, then even with a knife would be allowed. So that's why it doesn't fit with the Mishnah. How about the other way around? The one that answered and said that it's permitted when it's dry, but not when it's wet. Why didn't he give the answer that the one that says it's allowed is when using your hand, when it says not allowed is using a knife? Amalach bakli hatanan im bakli kan vekan asur. Wait, we already said that. You don't need to say it twice. In other words, our Mishnah said if you use a knife, you're not allowed to cut off the wart. So now, if you're going to tell me that our Mishnah in Pesachim, the Mishnah Pesachim is also with a knife, well, then it says not allowed. You already said that. It shouldn't be redundant, and therefore he doesn't want to say that this is with a knife and this one, the beginning one, is by hand, because it doesn't make sense to say it twice. Therefore, this has to be by hand also. If it's this by hand and this by hand, what's the difference between them? And that's why he came up with this one is dry and this one is moist. Okay, so now we know why he didn't say that. Ve'idach, and how about the first stage? Why don't they agree with that? Isn't that a good point? Why'd you say it twice that you're not allowed to do with a knife? Oh, well, we had to repeat the knife case because over here in Mishnah Pesachim, it adds that Rabbi Eliezer says it's permitted. So that's a big chidush. He would say it's permitted not only by hand, but even with a knife. Rabbi Eliezer says you can bring the knife and cut it. So that's why he has to repeat it. We wouldn't know that only from our Mishnah in Eruvin. All right. Now, how about the other one? What do you say about that? No, you can't say that it's with a knife, because that the first case is the case with a knife, because it has to be similar to the other ones. Carrying something, or an animal that's alive, right? A live animal is only midrabanan because it could walk, and also bringing it from outside the tuchum is midrabanan because tuchum Shabbat, most opinions say, is midrabanan, and therefore the case of cutting off a wart has to be similarly in the category of midrabanan. It's only midrabanan if I use my hand. If I use a knife, it would have been deoraita. So it has to fit with the categories of the other two, and that's why he says it has to be by hand. All right, that seems to be a good point, that they all have to be the same level. The idach. So the first opinion will come back and say, "Herkebo de lo natan, damar achai noset atzmo." You know, the Mishnah may disagree with Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Natan says a live thing carries itself, and therefore you're allowed to carry midoraita. But he disagrees with that. And that Mishnah can follow the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, the other two things on the list could be deoraita, and therefore this one can also be deoraita, and therefore this one can also be with a knife. And that's why he says it has to be talking about moist, and the other one's about something dry. Okay, good. So now we were able to figure all that out, why each one says like the other. But now Rav Yosef is going to come. So let's come back to our outline, right? We saw the first two opinions. Rav Yosef is going to come with a third opinion. He rejects both of these first two, and he's going to say Mishnah Eruvin is talking about in the Bet HaMikdash itself. A person brings an animal in the Bet HaMikdash, they're inspecting it, and they find a wart, they can cut it off. But Pesach is inspected at home, so even though it's for the Bet HaMikdash, it's not in the Bet HaMikdash, and that's why Mishnah Pesachim says it's not allowed, because the law that en shivut b'mikdash applies only actually in the Bet HaMikdash, not anywhere else. So let's see how he says it. Metiv Rav Yosef, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Kal v'chomer, Uma shechita she'im mishum melacha tocha et haShabbat, elu shemishum shivut en odin she'idchu et haShabbat. So first he rejects everything here before, and he brings a kal v'chomer. He says shechita, actually cutting the animal, is a melacha, clearly a melacha, and you can override Shabbat for doing that. So other things that are only shivut, right, like cutting a wart, for sure should be allowed. So like what are we even talking about? Any problem, anything of shivut should be allowed, and therefore I don't agree with your interpretations. Rather, what could be the difference? In other words, in the Bet HaMikdash, everything should be allowed. Rather, Ela Amar Rav Yosef, Ha veha biyad. Both Mishnayot are talking about using a knife, and ushvut mikdash b'mikdash hitiru, shvut de mikdash b'medina lo hitiru, violating a dirabanan in bayad. Sorry, not with a knife. Bayad. I don't know if I've said that. So since it's using a hand, it's midrabanan, because the usual way is with a knife. So an unusual way, b'shinui, is using your hand to scrape it off. So we're only talking about midrabanan, and you're allowed to violate a drabanan, a shivut, for the Bet HaMikdash when you're in the Bet HaMikdash. That's allowed. That's what we're talking about in our Mishnah in Masechet Eruvin. However, shvut de mikdash ba medina, but violating a shvut for the Bet HaMikdash while you're at home, lo hitiru, that they did not allow, and that's Mishnah Pesachim, because the Pesach sacrifice was inspected at home. All right, so that's his answer, but we're going to have a couple of questions on it. So Abaye, who was his student, was repeating this. Itibe Rav Safra le'Abaye. Rav Safra presents him a challenge. Haya koreh b'sefer ala iskupa, v'nitgalgel ha'sefer miyado v'golelo etzlo. Remember that Mishnah? You're sitting and reading a scroll on the doorstep, and it rolls away. You're holding on to one end, and the rest of it is out in the street. You're allowed to roll it back. That's interesting. Why are you allowed to roll it back? If it was a secular scroll, let's say, you're reading Homer, right? And it rolls away, you're not allowed to roll it back up because there's a gezerah. that you next time the whole thing may roll away and you won't be holding on to anything, and then you're going to stand up, you're going to go and pick it up from the street and bring it inside, and so you're going to violate. Therefore, even if you're holding on to it, you're not allowed to roll it back. That's in general. But because it's a sacred scroll, because it's kadosh, so we say it's not nice, it's disrespectful to leave it like that, so we forego the gezerah and allow a person to roll it up. That's equivalent to something de mikdash. They're interpreting de mikdash as not only actually something that belongs to the Bet HaMikdash, but anything that is holy. And so therefore you see that even though the person is at home, he is allowed to violate the Rabbanan for the purpose of something that's kadosh. And so this is a proof that even at home you can. And this goes against what Rav Yosef said here, that Korban Pesach, when you're at home, you cannot violate the Rabbanan. You should be able to violate the Rabbanan at home also in order to make something fit to be kadosh. That's the question. Answer, Velo okimna be'iskupa karmelit, urshut rabim ovedet lefaneha, dechevan de'igdo beyad, afilu shivut nami leka. Hold on, he wasn't, remember we talked about it, and he wasn't talking about his inside his home, urshut ha'yachid, urshut rabim, where that would be a doraita. Here it's talking about that the skupa is such a size that it's karmelit, meaning it's only the shut rabim midirabanan, and you have a street in front of you. Therefore, even if it would roll out totally from his hands and he picked it up and brought it in, it would only be a problem midirabanan. So therefore, in this case, where he's actually holding on to it, there's not even a shivut, right? So there's no reason to make a gezerah in this case, because you're not going to make a gezerah on a gezerah. You're not going to make a gezerah on a shvut. And that's the reason he's allowed to bring it in, not because it's holy. And so therefore, there's no proof that something outside the Bet HaMikdash is allowed for holy reasons. Okay, we dodged that one. But now we have another problem. Itibe, another question he asked, if you, the 14th of Nisan happens to fall out on Shabbat, and that means you're going to be eating the Korban Pesach on Motzei Shabbat, right? You have to prepare for the Seder. But we prepare it usually the night before, the day before, the afternoon before, which is on Shabbat itself. So it says here, you are allowed to lower the Korban Pesach into the pit, into the fire, even right before Shabbat, before nightfall, even while it's still Shabbat. And then it'll continue to cook after Shabbat ends. So that's permitted. Now, why is that permitted? In general, if it was not Pesach, and let's say, I wanted to prepare from Shabbat something for after Shabbat. So I take some food and that's raw, and I put it in the oven on Shabbat, but it's not going to get cooked till Shabbat's over, right? Is that allowed? Well, technically, midoraita, it's allowed because it's not being cooked on Shabbat, if I put it in only a few minutes before, but there's a gezerah. I can't put anything in the oven on Shabbat because I may look at the coals and I see that the coals are going out and stoke the coals and increase the fire. So we have a gezerah. In general, we make a gezerah against using an oven anything that has an open flame. But here you see that for the sake of Korban Pesach, I am allowed to do it. Now, where am I cooking this? I'm cooking it at home. Everybody, they would bring their korban to the Bet HaMikdash. They would slaughter it, take the blood, and then they bring it back home and cook it in fire pits. So you see that you can violate the Rabbanan. That's even at home if it's for the Bet HaMikdash, and that goes against the principle that Rav Yosef said to resolve this case. Ishtik. Abaye was silent. He didn't have an answer. Wow, stumped him. Okay. So finally, one day he came and spoke about this with his teacher, with Rav Yosef. So the Abaye says, Rav Safra asked me this good question. What do you have to say? You have a good answer. You should have told them that the people that are making Korban Pesach, that's the Chabura. It's a group of people that got together and chipped in. And so they're all doing this together and they're excited about the mitzvah and they're going to be careful, right? Even if one person comes and almost makes a mistake, let's say they'll take a stick and start to poke the coals, his friend will be there and say, no, you can't do that. It's still Shabbat. Shabbat's not over yet. Hold on. So therefore, in this particular case, we don't have to worry about the gezerah. But in general, you do worry about a gezerah even outside. And therefore, that's why Mishnah Pesachim says you cannot remove a wart on the Korban Pesach, because that you're preparing at home. And so the answer is fine. Good. So he's able to save himself. Why? How come Abaye didn't think of it? Why was he quiet? Seems to be a answer he should have come up with. Like we explained, Abaye, Kohanim zirizinhen amrinan. Bnei Chabura zirizinhen lo amrinan. He says, Kohanim, when they're in the Bet HaMikdash, the Kohanim preparing, they are very careful, and they'll make sure that with each other that no one will violate any shivut, any drabana. They'll make sure that no one will violate any doraita. Therefore, they don't have to keep the gezerot. But that only applies to Kohanim, and Bnei Chabura, who knows what kind of people get together to make Korban Pesach. Not all of them are so knowledgeable, not all of them are so careful, and so we cannot apply that outside the Bet HaMikdash, and that's why, it's not that he didn't think of the reason, he didn't agree with the reason, and that's why he didn't say it. All right, good. And now we get to the last answer of Rava, which is that the Mishnah in Eruvin, which permits, is actually the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says you can do all preparations for a mitzvah, a mitzvah that you're allowed to do on Shabbat, you're allowed to do the preparations too. And Mishnah Pesachim is Rabbanan. It has to be Rabbanan because Mishnah Pesachim actually mentions Rabbi Eliezer as the counter, as the person arguing with Rabbanan. Okay, so let's see if we can make that fit. In general, we don't want a Stam Mishnah to be like a minority opinion, but Rava finds this to be the best answer. So let's see. Rava Amar, Rabbi Eliezer, right, our Mishnah, which permits, is Rabbi Eliezer. Damar machshire mitzvah, tochin et haShabbat. Even preparations for a mitzvah, like carrying the knife for Brit Milah, even that, you override Shabbat, and you can do it on purpose. You don't have to try to bring it from before. That's what people usually think. Let's see. However, now Rava is adding something to the Rabbi Eliezer. No, you can't do that on purpose. Any way you can minimize the violation of Shabbat, you should. So therefore, like if it's you forgot the knife for Brit Milah, you could bring it in the street. But if you can bring it on rooftops, then bring it on the rooftops, right? If you need to, you can even violate a doraita. But if you can do it only d'Rabbanan, do it only d'Rabbanan. If you could do a lesser d'Rabbanan, then do it even in a lesser way. And that's the reason why in our Mishnah, see, yes, he's answering a question, because our Mishnah says if you find a wart on an animal, you're allowed to take it off by hand, but not with a knife. If this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, why can't I just take a knife? Doesn't he say I can do anything to prepare? So we have to add this, that even Rabbi Eliezer says, do it in a lesser way. If you can get it off with your hand, then do that. It'll only be d'Rabbanan. Okay. And how does he know that? Maihi. How does he know that Rabbi Eliezer says minimize the prohibition, minimize the violation? This reminds me of the halacha that's relevant today. If you have like a medical emergency, should you try to minimize? Let's say it's a sakanat nefashot, and you say, well, I can save his life with violating only d'Rabbanan. Do we even have to bother? Or that's it. Once I'm violating Shabbat, I can do everything myself, right? Okay. Generally, for sakanat nefashot, you say, don't worry about it. You just, you do anything that you have to do. Okay, but that's the question here. So, Mahi, how do we know? What's the source that the Eliezer wants to minimize violation of Shabbat, even if it's allowed? The Tanya, Kohen shalta bo yabelet. Now we're talking about a wart that's on the Kohen, right? A Kohen also is disqualified from serving if he has a blemish. So if he sees all of a sudden, he's about to prepare a korban, and he sees, oh no, I have a wart. Okay, he's got to get it off, which he's allowed to do on Shabbat because it's for the service of the Bet HaMikdash. So what should he do? Chavero chotcha lo b'shinav. Okay, I told you it's going to get a little bit impolite. So his friend can bite off his wart. Okay, so now b'shinav with his teeth. In b'shinav in b'kli lo. Chavero in ihula. So notice two important things. First of all, that he's using his teeth not even his hand, and certainly not a knife, and it's his friend doing it, which is also, a very different way of doing it. Don't do it yourself, but rather have your friend do it. Okay, now Maneh, who is the author of this baraita? Okay, we have to note that regarding taking off something by hand, Rabbi Eliezer happens to be stringent about this particular item more than Rabbanan. Even though he's lenient regarding preparation for Shabbat, he's stringent about this. So let's see. Ilema Rabbanan uba mikdash. So if it's the general rabbis, majority rabbis, kevan de amre Rabbanan be'alma mishum shivut. Since in general they say that taking off or biting off a wart or using biting off something is shivut. So hacha malihu mali chavero. So once you're doing biting, and that's midrabanan, why would you need to ask your friend to do it? Right? You could do it yourself. There's no benefit in having that extra layer of doing it indirectly. So it doesn't make sense that this is the opinion of Rabbanan, because they wouldn't need a friend to do it. In general, Rabbi Eliezer says that taking off, let's say, like a hangnail or something, or a wart, is if you bite it off, that's actually chayav chatat. It's still asur midoraita, even if you're doing it in that strange way. So v'hacha afagav de mechshirei mitzvah dochin Shabbat kamad afshar l'shanuyeh meshanenan. And so you see here that even though you cannot take it off by biting it yourself, that's why you ask your friend to do it, to make it less. So even though the Rabbi Eliezer in general says you're allowed to violate Shabbat if you need to, but if you don't need to, if you can ask your friend to do it, then that's better. So this is a source to show that Rabbi Eliezer does believe in minimizing violation of Shabbat, and that's why in our Mishnah could be Rabbi Eliezer, and he says you should better to use your hand than to use a knife, because that's a better way to do it. So that would be an answer. But we reject this. No, le'olam Rabbanan. No, really, that baraita really could be the Rabbanan. V'alta bechreso hachanameh. Hachamaiskinan kigon shalta lo neshicha begabo o basile yadav. Tihu la maseh shakel la. Maybe the only reason it talks about his friend taking it off, biting it off, is because it's on his back or on his elbow, right? But really, it's just a practical thing. If it was on a person's abdomen, then he can reach it. He would take it off with his hand. But try to reach the back of your elbow. Try to get it off your back, right? It's impossible. So that's why he asks his friend to do it. It's not because it's an extra layer of doing it more indirectly. So it's nothing to do with that. And so therefore, it doesn't have to be Rabbi Eliezer. So now you don't have a source. Well, that doesn't work either. Vida banan, nishkele, nihale, bayad. V'tifshot de Rabbi Elazar. If in fact this is Rabbanan, then just do it by hand. Why are you talking about with using teeth? Right? Who asked you to use teeth? Because the Rabbanan say you can use a hand, and that's all the Rabbanan. So, and that you could do anywhere. So the fact that it's bringing teeth in is yet an extra layer. That shows that it has to be Rabbi Eliezer. And furthermore, Rabbi Elazar, not to be confused with Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Elazar is a Amorah. Rabbi Elazar said about a different context. Rabbi Elazar machloket bayad, aval bekli dibrei hakol chayav. That the dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer is only regarding doing it by hand, but with using a kli, using a knife, everybody thinks is chayav. This was like a chidush that he said. Now, if that baraita was actually Rabbanan, then it wouldn't be a chidush. You could just learn it from there, because then they say that you can take it off by hand. So no, by hand is okay, knife is not okay. From the fact that it's not a simple chidush, therefore it must be that is actually to be Eliezer, and that's why he says that the law about biting it off. And since it's biting, it's not clear where's the demarcation. Is it biting or by hand or a knife? And so all this makes more sense if this is a Eliezer. Okay, let's see if that really works. Wait, so according to you, that baraita is Eliezer. Why not? You also agree that he should take it off by hand and not use his mouth to bite it off. Hi, Mai. Wait, so what do you mean? What kind of question is that? אלא ימת רבנן היא, נשקלן יעלה ביד, ותו לה מידה. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that taking off with the hand is in fact worse than biting it off, because if you take it off by hand, there's a gezerah, then you're going to go get a knife. Because using your hands is only one step removed from getting with a knife. Whereas if you use your teeth, then you're going to really think a lot of times before you go and get a knife, because you're going to wonder, why am I using my teeth? This is a crazy way to remove a wart. And so then you're not going to come. There's no less reason to make a gezerah. So it makes sense if it is in fact Rabbi Eliezer. But if you say it's Rabbanan, then the hand is the same, because that is the Rabbanan, and you wouldn't need to say anything else. And so that we conclude with that this is in fact, according to Rava, is our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, good. So we have these four opinions, and that leads us to the last Mishnah for today, which is back to bandages. If a Kohen gets some kind of wound and he wants to use a reed as a bandage, is that permitted or not? And what's the difference between using a reed and how about a sash? And what size is the sash? Okay, not very complicated discussion, so let's see what we say here. Kohen shelaka be'espa'o. So he got some kind of wound on his finger. Korech aleha gemi b'mikdash. If he's in the Bet HaMikdash and it's bleeding and it doesn't look nice, and he wants to cover it with a reed, it's permitted. Aval lo b'medina, but not at home, because this is has a medical purpose, and so you're not allowed to do anything that's any medicine on Shabbat, as if it's not life-threatening, of course. If you're putting it on in order to draw blood, like you're putting on this reed because it will draw the blood out or absorb it, then it's prohibited everywhere. Because in that case, you don't need that for the Bet HaMikdash service. Then you're doing it for medical purposes. In other words, you're only allowed to put it on in the Bet HaMikdash to cover the wound so that it will look nicer when you are doing the temple service. So that's for the purpose of the Mikdash. And that's why you're allowed to violate what would otherwise be Asur Midrabanan. All right. So now a qualification. You're only allowed to use a reed. Aval silsol katan have yetur begadim. But if you're going to put a small sash on that's made of cloth, then you're going to violate a different thing, that a kohen can only have 4 pieces of clothing on, right? The 4 that are mentioned in the Torah that a kohen wears. He can't go and add more items of clothing, right? That would be Bal Tosif. He can't add things to the Torah. Or Kohen Gadol has 8, right? But let's assume it's a regular Kohen has 4. So if he puts on a cloth on his finger, then he's adding clothing. And that's why it has to be a reed, because a reed is not cloth, so it won't be considered clothing. That's the opinion of Rav Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yochanan amar, lo amru yetur begadim, ela bimkom begadim. Aval shelo bimkom begadim, la have yetur begadim. This is the whole law violation of adding more pieces of clothing for a kohen only applies to a place on the body where you clothe yourself. So you can't add another shirt, you can't add more pants, but your hands are exposed, and therefore, if you want to put something on your hands, then that's fine. Doesn't violate adding things. And therefore, according to him, the reed is just an example. But if you wanted to put a cloth band if you wanted to put a cloth band to cover up the wound, then that would be okay too. So Rabbi Yochanan is more lenient. Now, v'tepugle mishum chatzisa. Hold on. Why don't we say that both of them, and for anyone, how come you don't say that the reed and the sash are a chatzitza? In other words, let's say the Kohen is carrying a pan. So the halach has to be carrying the pan with his hand. If he has cloth around his hand, and then the cloth is going to, or the reed, is going to be an interposition between his skin and the pan. And that's why it should not be allowed no matter what, right? Besides, there's a different problem than adding clothing. So we answer bismol. Oh, it's talking about his left hand, which he's not using. So on the right hand, he holds the pan. In left hand, he has a Band-Aid on, and that's fine. The Band-Aid makes it look nice and does not make a chatzitza. That's one answer. Iname biyamin, b'shelo b'mkom avoda. Or it could even be on the right hand, but maybe it's on the back of his hand, the back of his finger, where he's not actually using that to touch, and then that would be fine. Okay, so so far we have two opinions, and now we have a third. ופליגה דרבה, דאמר רבה, אמר רב חיסדא, במקום בגדים אפילו נימה אחת חוצצת, שלא במקום בגדים 3 על 3 חוצצות, פחות מ3 על 3 אינן חוצצות. So he makes a distinction. If it's on a part of the body that you have to cover with the regular clothing, then you cannot even add one thread, and otherwise that would be a chatzitza. It's separating between yourself, your skin, and the garment, or between the garment and whatever else it's touching. So that would be chatzitza. However, if it's on your, not where you put clothing, on your hand, then if it's very small, it's fine, it's not significant. If it's 3 by 3 tefachim big, right, then that becomes a significant thing. So if I take a 3 by 3 handkerchief and I wrap it around my hand, or some other place on the body that's maybe a mask, right? That if it's a 3 by 3, then that would be a problem of chatzitza, and I couldn't wear it. So therefore, he would say in this case of the Mishnah, that reed or whatever, it could be made out of anything, even cloth, just has to be small. Okay, now let's compare these cases, these opinions. Ad Rabbi Yochanan vadai peliga. For sure, Rava disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says, if it's not in the place of clothing, then it doesn't count. You can add anything you want. There's no problem. And he says, if it's 3 by 3, it is a problem. So you see that it doesn't fit with Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. However, what about the first opinion? Do you think he would agree or disagree with the first opinion that says you can put a reed on, but not something, a sash made out of cloth? That would not be allowed, right? Do you think he agrees with that? At face value, seems to disagree, because he says it depends if it's 3 by 3. And the Rabbi Yehuda says even if it's less, a small piece of cloth is not allowed. So it doesn't look like he agrees. But we can make him agree. How? A small sash, even if it's small, but it's significant, right? It's a specialty item. So even if it's small, it's important, and therefore even Rava would agree that that's prohibited to put on a part of the body that's usually exposed. 3 by 3 is just a general rule, because usually something that's a handkerchief size is something important. But even if it's smaller, if it's important for another reason, it's also would be a problem. Okay, good. So we saw all 3 opinions. Now we're just going to say almost the same thing, but in slightly different order. So lishna charina. This is like all the same 3 opinions, but we're just in a slightly different variation. Amrila, some report the previous discussion in a different way. Amar Rav Yehuda bered Rabbi Chiya, that's the first opinion. Lo shanu elagemi. The Mishnah said you can use a reed, only a reed. Aval silsol katan choses. But if you use a sash, then that is a chatzitza. Okay, this is a difference between this version and the first version. The first version says if you use a sash, then you're adding clothing. That's the problem, adding clothing. Here it says no, it's not a problem adding clothing. It's a problem of making a chatzitza. Rabbi Yochanan amar lo amru chatzitza בפחות משלוש על שלוש, אלא במקום בגדים. אבל שלא במקום בגדים, 3 על 3 חוצצות, פחות משלוש אין חוצצין. So now it's Rabbi Yochanan that makes the distinction that we said in the name of Rabbah. It's not Rabbah, now it's Rabbi Yochanan. And he says it's only chatzitza if it's less than 3 where you have clothing. In other words, where you usually clothe yourself, any size is not good. But in a place where you don't usually put clothing on, like your hands, then only if it's 3 by 3, less than that, it's okay. V'hainu de Rava amar Rav Chisda. Oh, and that also Rava agrees, says the same thing. Okay, so they do agree in both versions. They agree. In this case, they're saying exactly the same thing, and Rabbi Yochanan says it first. So lema pliga de Rav Yehuda bered de Rabbi Chiya. Do these two, their opinion about bigger than 3 and less than 3, does that disagree with Rav Yehuda, who says a sash is no good, even if it's small? It seems to disagree, right? No. Even though it's small, it's important. And therefore, maybe everyone would agree that it's in fact not allowed. Maybe they would agree. But of course, maybe not. And now, following the maybe not, we have the last statement. Ul Rabbi Yochanan. Adishma'inan gemi Ishmenan silsol katan. If that, according to the Yochanan, if you why did the Mishnah mention a reed? If it could have mentioned a sash, right? In other words, if he agrees that's true, that you can use either one, then why not tell me a chidush, a bigger chidush, and tell me that silsol katan is also good, right? So it is according to this answer, right? Gemi sounds like only gemi, not silsol katan. So are you sure he agrees? And he says yes, we can answer that. Milta agavorche kamashmalan de gemi maseh. He wanted to teach us just good medical advice that if you have a wound, better to use a reed because it'll heal it better rather than using a sash made out of cloth. That is not going to have as good in terms of healing properties. But in fact, if you asked him, he would say that both are allowed, and so he could be in agreement with the other opinion. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.